I'm also not going to attempt anything in the way of a technical summary of major works in experimental economics. I mainly want to use this opportunity to develop a theme, or two themes, which the paper is used to many experiments to illustrate, and also some empirical examples in the field. I want to begin with three textual quotations. The first is from David Hume, 1739. When we leave our closet and engage in the common affairs of life, reason's conclusions seem to vanish, like the phantoms of the night on the appearance of the morning, and 'tis difficult for us to retain even that conviction which we had attained with difficulty. The second is by Hayek, the 1974 Nobel Prize winner in economics. We must constantly adjust our lives, our thoughts, and our emotions in order to live simultaneously within different kinds of orders according to different rules. If we were to apply the unmodified, uncurbed rules of caring intervention to do visible good, of the small band or troop or our families, to the extended order of cooperation through markets, as our instincts and sentimental yearnings often make us wish to do, we would destroy it. Yet, if we were to always apply the non-cooperative rules of the extended order to our more intimate groupings, we would crush them. And the third is from Herb Simon, also a Nobel Prize winner in economics. We have become accustomed to the idea that a natural system like the human body or an ecosystem regulates itself. To explain the regulation, we look for feedback loops rather than a central planning and directing body. But somehow our intuitions about self-regulation do not carry over to the artificial systems of human society. Thus, the disbelief always expressed by my architecture students about medieval cities as marvelously patterned systems that had mostly just grown in response to myriads of individual decisions. To my students, a pattern implied a planner. The idea that a city could acquire its pattern as naturally as a snowflake was foreign to them. End of quotations. Historically, a recurrent theme in economics is that the values to which people respond are not confined to those one would expect based on the narrowly defined canons of rationality. These roots go back to Adam Smith, who examined the moral sympathies that characterize natural human sociality. Contrary to vulgar impressions, in Smith's view, each individual defined and pursued his own interest in his own way, and individuals were mischaracterized by the metaphor economic man. This careless scholarship fails to recognize the key proposition articulated by the Scottish philosophers, namely, to do good for others does not require deliberate action to further the perceived interests of others. As Mandeville so succinctly put it, the worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. Many contemporary scholars, and not only popular writers, have reversed Mandeville's proposition and argued that the standard socioeconomic science model requires, justifies, and promotes selfish behavior. On the contrary, because enforceable rights can never cover every margin of decision, opportunism in all relational contracting and exchange across time are costs, not benefits, in achieving long-term value from trade. An ideology of honesty means that people play the game of trade rather than steal, although crime may often pay the rational lawbreaker who always chooses dominant strategies. Nor does non-selfish behavior in ordinary market transactions prevent those transactions from promoting specialization and creating wealth. Cultures that have evolved markets have enormously expanded resource specialization, created commensurate gains from exchange, and are wealthier than those that have not. This proposition says nothing about the necessity of human selfishness. The increased wealth of particular individuals can be used for consumption, investment, to pay taxes, for MacArthur Fellows, gifted to the symphony, the Smithsonian, or the poor. Markets economize on but do not eliminate virtue. Research in economic psychology has prominently reported examples where fairness considerations are said to contradict the rationality assumptions of the standard model. But experimental economists have reported mixed results on rationality. People are often better in, for example, two-person anonymous interactions, in agreement with, for example, in flow, supply, and demand markets, or worse, for example, in asset trading, in achieving gains for themselves and others than is predicted by rational analysis. Patterns in these predictions, or these contradictions, and confirmations provide important clues to the implicit rules or norms that people may follow and can motivate new theoretical hypotheses for examination in both the field and the laboratory. The pattern of results greatly modifies the prevailing, and I believe misguided, rational standard model and richly modernize the unadulterated message of the Scottish philosophers. The organizing principle throughout this paper is the simultaneous existence of two rational orders. I shall try to make the case that both orders are distinguishing characteristics of what we are as social creatures, that both are essential to understanding and unifying a large body of experience from socioeconomic life and the experimental laboratory, and in charting relevant new directions for economic theory, as well as experimental empirical programs. The first concept of a rational order derives from the standard model going back to the 17th century. This model is an example of what Hayek has called constructivist rationality, or constructivism, which stems from Bacon, Hobbes, but particularly Descartes, who believed and argued that all worthwhile social institutions were and should be created by conscious deductive processes of human reason. In economics, the standard model leads to rational predictive models of decision that motivate research hypotheses that experimentalists have been testing in the laboratory since mid-20th century. Although the test results tend to be confirming in impersonal market exchange, where well-defined, with well-defined property rights, the results are famously and incalcitrantly mixed in personal exchange, notably in a great variety of two-person extensive-form games where some half the people attempt and frequently succeed when risking cooperation even when anonymously paired with people whose identity they will never know. These results have motivated constructivist extensions of game theory based on other regarding in addition to own regarding preferences, and on learning, the idea that the predictions of the standard model might be approached over time by trial and error adaptation processes. An alternative or complementary explanation of some of these contradictions to theory is that people may use social grown norms of trust and reciprocity, including equity, meaning each according to his justly earned desert, that is, equality of opportunity, not outcome, to achieve cooperative states superior to individually rational decision outcomes. I and my co-authors began investigating the reciprocity hypothesis in the early 1990s. Mechanically, utilities can serve as immediate placeholders for reciprocal trust, but as surface indicators serve poorly to generate new hypotheses designed to understand interactive processes. Good theory must be an engine for generating testable hypotheses, and utility theory runs out of fuel quickly. Utility values tend to be seen as providing the ultimate given data, and the scientific conversation tends to stop. Although reciprocity seems to be a leader in the comparisons we have made, its strength is not uniform across all tests, and much remains to be learned about the hidden recesses of meaning in human behavior and the circumstances in which cooperative or non-cooperative behavior is manifest. Technically, the issue is how most productively to model agent types by extending game theory so that types are as an integral part of the predictive content rather than merely imported as an ex post technical explanation of experimental results. Thus, moves can signal types and affect decision, which explains why game form matters and why payoffs available but foregone can affect outcomes. These elements, this extended model and with these elements must be part of the internal structure of the theory, such that outcomes become predictions conditional on elementary specifications. In market experiments, where cooperation can occur through the coordination function of prices produced by but simultaneously resulting from interaction with individual choice behavior, the results are more commonly in accord with standard competitive models that maximize group welfare. This professional victory is hollowed by the failure of standard theory to predict the surprisingly weak conditions under which the results obtain. Thus, for tractability, Cartesian rationalism provisionally assumes or requires agents to possess complete payoff and other information, far more than could ever be given to one mind in a complex economy. In economics, the resulting exercises are believed to sharpen economic thinking as if-then parables. Yet these assumptions are unlikely to approximate the level of ignorance that has conditioned either individual behavior or our evolved institutions as abstract norms or rules independent of particular parameters which have survived as part of the world of experience. The temptation is to ignore this reality because it is poorly understood and does not yield to our familiar modeling tools. and to proceed in the implicit belief that our parables capture what is most essential about what we observe. Having sharpened our understanding on Cartesian complete information parables, we carry these tools into the world for application without all the necessary caveats that reflect the tractability constraints imposed by our bounded professional cognitive capacities as theorists. In summary, constructivism uses reason to deliberately create rules of action and create human socio-economic institutions that yield outcomes deemed preferable given particular circumstances to those produced by alternative arrangements. Although constructivism is one of the crowning achievements of the human intellect, it is important to remain sensitive to the fact that human institutions and most decision-making is not guided primarily, if at all, by constructivism. Emergent arrangements, even if initially constructivist, must have survival properties that take account of opportunity costs and environmental challenges invisible to our modeling efforts. Since our theories and thought processes about social systems involve the conscious and deliberate use of reason, it is necessary to constantly remind ourselves that human activity is diffused and dominated by unconscious, autonomic, neurophysiological systems that enable people to function effectively without always calling upon the brain's scarcest resource, attentional and reasoning circuitry. This is an important economizing property of how the brain works. If it were otherwise, no one could get through the day under the burden of the self-conscious monitoring and planning of every trivial action in detail. As Hayek put it, if we stop doing everything for which we do not know the reason, or for which we cannot provide a justification, we would probably soon be dead. Although no one can express in thoughts, let alone words, all that he or she knows and does not know, but might call upon or need to discover for some purposive action. Imagine the strain on the brain's resources if at the supermarket a shopper were required to explicitly evaluate his preferences for every combination of the tens of thousands of grocery items that are feasible for his budget. Such mental processes are enormously opportunity costly, and implicitly our brain knows if our conscious mind does not know that we must avoid incurring costs that are not worth the benefit. The challenge of any unfamiliar action or problem appears first to trigger a search by the brain to bring to the conscious mind what one knows that is related to the decision context. Context triggers autobiographic experiential memory, which explains why context surfaces as a non-trivial treatment, particularly in small group experiments. The brain, including the entire neurophysiological system, takes over directly in the case of familiar, mastered tasks and plays the equivalent of lightning chess when the expert trades, plays Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto, or connects with a 95-mile-per-hour fastball, all without conscious thinking by the mind. We fail utterly to possess natural mechanisms for reminding ourselves of the brain's offline activities and accomplishments. This important proposition has led Gazzaniga to ask why the brain fools the mind into believing it is in control. And to Hayek, who thoroughly understood this proposition, what was the fatal conceit? It was the idea that the ability to acquire skills stems from reason. The constructivist mind makes a fatal error, blinding itself to understanding as we are warned, quote, one should never suppose that our reason is in the higher critical position and that only those moral rules are valid that reason endorses, end of quote. But the anthropocentric, morphic mind routinely makes this significant error. These considerations lead to the second concept of a rational order as an undesigned ecological system that emerges out of cultural and biological evolutionary processes. Homegrown principles of action, norms, traditions, and morality. Ecological rationality uses reason, rational reconstruction, to examine the behavior of individuals based on their experience and folk knowledge, who are naive in their ability to apply constructivist tools to the decisions they make, to understand the emergent order in human cultures, to discover the possible intelligence embodied in the rules, norms, and institutions of our cultural and biological heritage that are created from human interaction, but not by deliberate human design. People follow rules without being able to articulate them, but they can be discovered. This is the intellectual heritage of the Scottish philosophers who described and interpreted the social and economic order they observed. An 18th century precursor of Herbert Simon, David Hume, was concerned with the limits of reason, the bounds on human understanding, and was scaling back the exaggerated claims of Cartesian constructivism. To Hume, rationality was phenomena that reason discovers in emergent institutions. Thus, the rules of morality are not conclusions of our reason. Quote from David Hume. Adam Smith developed the idea of emergent order for economics. Truth is discovered in the form of the intelligence embodied in rules and traditions that have formed inscrutably out of the ancient history of human social interaction. This is the antithesis of the anthropocentric belief that if an observed social mechanism is functional, somebody in the unrecorded past must have used reason consciously to create it to serve its perceived intended purposes. In experimental economics, the 18th century Scottish tradition is revealed in the observation of emergent order in numerous studies of existing market institutions, such as the continuous double auction and other institutions. To paraphrase Adam Smith, people in these experiments are led to promote group welfare, enhancing social ends that are not part of their intention. This principle is supported by hundreds of experiments whose environments and institutions may exceed the capacity of formal game theoretic analysis to articulate predictive models, but they do not exceed the functional capacity of collectives of incompletely informed human decision makers whose autonomic mental algorithms coordinate behavior through the rules of the institution. Think of institutions as social algorithms to generate high levels of measured performance. Acknowledging and investigating the workings of unseen processes are essential to the growth of our understanding of social phenomena and enable us to probe beyond the anthropocentric limitations of constructivism. Both kinds of rationality have influenced the design and interpretation of experiments in economics. Thus, if people in certain contexts make choices that contradict our formal theory of rationality, rather than conclude that they are irrational, some ask why, re-examine, maintain hypotheses, including all aspects of the experiments, procedures, payoffs, context, instructions, and so forth, and inquire as to what new concepts and experimental designs can help us to better understand the behavior. They ask, what is the subject's perception of the problem that they're trying to solve? Finally, understanding decision requires knowledge beyond the traditional bounds of economics, a challenge to which Hume and Smith were not strangers. This is manifest in the recent studies of the neural correlates of strategic interaction. My colleague Kevin McCabe calls it neuroeconomics, using functional magnetic resonance imaging and other brain imaging technologies. That research explores the neural correlates of intentions or mind reading and other hypotheses about information choice and own versus other payoffs in determining interactive behavior. I'm going to refer to the Nobel Foundation site for a lot of details articulating this theme. I think in the time that I have available, I'm just going to provide a very few illustrations. The paper gives you examples from economics, law, experimental economics, and psychology. I will say something, though, about impersonal exchange through markets, giving you a very short summary and examples. But first, let me say something about how the two concepts of a rational order are related. Constructivism takes as given the social structures generated by emergent institutions that we observe in the world and proceeds to model it formally. An example would be the Dutch auction or the alleged isomorphic equivalent to seal bid auction. Constructivist models need not ask why or how an auction institution arose, or what were the ecological conditions that created it, or why there are so many distinct auction institutions. In some cases, it is the other way around. Thus, revenue equivalence theorems show that the standard auctions generate identical expected outcomes, which, if taken literally, leave no modeled economic reason for choosing between them. More generally, using rational theory, one represents an observed socioeconomic system or situation with an abstract, interactive game tree. In contrast, the ecological concept of rationality asks from whence came the structure captured by the tree. Why this social practice from which we can abstract a particular game and not another? Were there other practices and associated game trees that lacked survival properties and were successfully invaded by what we observe? There is a sense in which ecological systems, whether cultural or biological, must necessarily be or in the process of becoming rational. Namely, they serve the fitness needs of those who unintentionally created them through their interactions. Constructivist mental models are based on assumptions about behavior, structure, and the value knowledge environment. These assumptions might be correct, incorrect, or irrelevant, and the models may or may not lead to rational action in the sense of serving well the needs of those to whom the models apply. As theorists, the professional charge for which we are paid is to formulate and prove theorems. A theorem is a mapping from assumptions into testable or observable implications. The demands of tractability loom large in this exercise, and to get anything much in the way of results, it is necessary to consider both the assumptions and their implications as variables. Few game theorists, building on the assumption that agents always choose dominant strategies, believe this to characterize the behavior of all agents in all situations. Hence, the near universal characterization, the nearly universal justification of theory as an exercise in understanding. But to understand what is, the tip of the knowledge iceberg, requires understanding of a great deal that is not. In the laboratory, we can not only rationally reconstruct counterfactuals, as in economic history, but also use experiments to test and examine their properties. I'm going to give you now an example, in the time I have left, that arises from deregulating airline routes. This is a fairly short example, an example of ecological rationality. Airline route deregulation brought an unanticipated reorganization of the network called the hub and spoke system. This is an ecologically rational response, apparently anticipated by none of the constructivist arguments for deregulation and predicted by no one. Nor could it have been uncovered, I submit, in 1978 by surveys of airline managers or by marketing surveys of airline customers. Unknown to both managers and customers was the subsequently revealed decision preferences of customers who unknowingly favored frequency of daily departure and arrival times, a preference that had to be discovered through market experimentation. Non-stop service between secondary cities was simply not sustainable in a deregulated world of free choice. The only way to achieve both a reasonable frequency of service and profitable load factors among secondary cities was the flights to connect through hubs. Hence the hypothesis that a rational ecological equilibrium emerged to dominate repeated constructivist attempts by business entrants and startup companies to satisfy an incompatible set of constraints provided by the microstructure of demand, profitability, and technology. Might it have been otherwise if airport runway rights or landing and takeoff slots had been an integral part of the deregulation of airline routes, and the time of day spot pricing of slots had emerged to reflect hub congestion costs? We do not know. But the effect of this hypothetical counterfactual on the viability of hub bypass could be assessed in laboratory experiments. As in all studies, of what is not, of course, the challenge is to estimate the parameters that would implement the appropriate economic environment. Let me just close by saying a little bit about psychology and markets. Psychologists and behavioral economists who study decision behavior almost uniformly report results contrary to rational theory. It was not always so, but the focus on anomalies beginning in the 1970s converted the emerging discovery enterprise into a search for contradictions between reports of behavior and the results of mainstream theory that constitute much of its core. Psychologists, to their credit, have maintained an intensive program examining the behavioral nature of these contradictions to the classical model. For example, Siegel and Foraker and Siegel, in separate work, reported both confirmations and contradictions and used the pattern to propose improved models. Similarly, in prospect theory, that we've heard from Danny Kahneman about this afternoon, they propose modifications of both the utility and the probability weighting functions of standard expected utility theory. Research studies that focus on the study of errors, however, can distort professional beliefs to say nothing of popular representations, if the primary emphasis is on the failures to the exclusion of the predictive successes of the theory. In summary, let me say that markets constitute an engine of productivity by supporting resource specialization through trade and creating a diverse wealth of goods and services. Markets are rule-governed institutions providing algorithms that select, process, and order the exploratory messages of agents who are better informed as to their personal circumstances than to that of others. As precautionary probes by agents yield to contracts, each becoming more certain of what must be given in order to receive, out of this interaction between minds, through the intermediary of rules, the process aggregates the dispersed symmetric information, converging more or less rapidly to predicted equilibria, static equilibria, but the paths defy prediction because our dynamics are so poorly understood. The resulting order is invisible to the participants, unlike the visible gains they reap. Agents discover what they need to know to achieve outcomes optimal against the constraining limits imposed by others. Thank you very much.